In Singapore, public housing is actually technically speaking for the entire nation. A public subsidy good has actually become a vehicle of private accumulation. And as a consequence of that, unintentionally, the HDB is in fact one of the factors that intensifies wealth inequality. HDB prices gone up by close to 10%. That's a really high rate of increase against wage increases. The legitimacy that comes with provision, which is a political capital, right, has also its downside in terms of obligation.
Today I am joined by Professor Chua Beng Huat. He is one of Singapore's most renowned and accomplished sociologists, and he is currently an Emeritus Professor at the National University of Singapore at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I really enjoyed his book, Liberalism Disavowed. It was one of the books that really opened up my mind to how Singapore got to where it was today. It helps unpack the Singapore economic miracle and poses questions about the dilemmas that the government will continue to face as it goes forward into the future. So, Professor Chua, I'd like to welcome you to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
The first question I had was on the question of liberalism. I think most people think about liberalism today. They have many different definitions. They have different ideas of what it means. But what I would like to ask as a starting question is, what does liberalism from your perspective as a sociologist mean?
There is about 300 years of history of liberalism. So there's by now accumulated all multiple versions. But the version that is most relevant to Singapore politics is actually liberal individualism, right? Where the emphasis is on liberal rights and freedom, which is freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of beliefs, freedom of assembly, public assembly. So the idea is that individuals should be free to express their opinion without any constraint, so to speak. And the idea is that in the marketplace of ideas, different ideas would, work each other out and ideally come to some kind of rational conclusion at the end, right? But of course, in the real world, it doesn't quite work that way. As you can see currently in the world, opinions become much more divided and much more, people lock into their position rather than listen to rational reasoning. So the ideal situation of, liberal individualism is really, as we can see now, highly problematic. And I think the Singapore government, the PAP government, from the very start, has been sort of anti-individualism. Partly is the history of the party itself. I mean, the party itself started out as relatively left-leaning social democrats. By the 1970s, they will economically become more and more sort of capitalist. But I think in the way they imagine society is organized has always been much more collectivist in their orientation, believing in community. For example, even now we see a very high emphasis on family and community and social cohesion, rather than this kind of atomized individualism, particularly of the American version of liberal individualism. Yeah. So in our context, I would say the liberalism is a particular post-war American version that the government confronts. So that's why we have in place constraints placed on the different freedoms that are taken for granted in the American institutions.
There was this idea that they would become the unipolar power. Many of the American elites kind of saw liberal democracy as the natural endpoint for most developing economies.
I think it's fairly understandable because the American clearly has won the Cold War. I mean, Ronald Reagan had his focus on destroying the Soviet Union. I mean, he basically characterized the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and he was out to basically destroy the empire. And they actually succeeded because by the late 70s, China has already marketized the economy. So in that sense, capitalism has succeeded. And then when Russia, liberalized both economically and politically, it actually destroyed the Communist Party of Russia. And at the same time, most of the Soviet Union members started to break away, and some immediately joined the capitalist NATO, right? So in that sense, there is that moment of early 90s, a euphoria of the triumph of liberal democratic capitalism. And the imagination is that the whole world will move that way because capitalism has by then no other alternatives. So there's this famous phrase from Margaret Thatcher that there is no alternative. And even at its most sort of euphoric moment, Francis Fukuyama, who actually announced the end of ideology and the end of history, because the end of history is because everything will become liberal democratic capital. Even at that point, he already noted that East Asia will be the challenge to liberal democracy because East Asian economies had been able to develop capitalism without the presumed liberal democratic politics. And this is basically fairly clear in China, followed by Vietnam. And in our case, we actually didn't receive that kind of attention, but we clearly have always been emphasizing, there was a period of time emphasizing what we call Asian values, which is, not particularly liberal. So I think even at its most euphoric point, there's a recognition that Asia would be marching to a kind of different beat, so to speak. And then fairly soon after that, in fact, liberalism was challenged by the rise of Islam. In the first year of the 21st century was the September 11 bombing of the World Trade Center, right? And since then, America, especially America, has been actually very involved in trying to contain Islam, not only in the Middle East, but wherever, there is Islamic fundamentalism. And then by 2000, by the sort of second decade of the 21st century, there is a rise of populist nationalism all in the West, starting with Brexit, followed by Trump, followed by now increasingly Western Europe, the rise of right-wing parties, nationalist parties in Western Europe, which are the, sort of flag barriers of liberal democracy, right? So in the very own home of liberal democracy in the West, there is now a counter ideology, essentially nativist kind of populist nationalism. So the euphoria was actually very short-lived. It may be about a decade. And now there's really no more celebration or no assurance. This whole idea that the whole world will turn liberal democratic capitalist is no longer on the card. Capitalism will continue to be the economic system that runs the world, but different countries have different ways of organizing capitalism, such as I said in my book, state capitalism in Singapore. But state capitalism is now more than, is actually in practice in a lot of countries, especially the most concerning for the Americans is China. I mean, China, the Americans complain about China is always about how the state backs state enterprises and doesn't play by the rule of the free market, so to speak, right? Yeah, so capitalism will be the only system, but there are different ways of organizing capital. It's not always about free market capitalism, that liberal democracy, that liberals assume to be the case.
There are many ways to reject or to have a different take from liberalism. In your book, you say that Singapore disavowed itself. We disrupted private property rights, which is maybe heresy to political liberals. And as you shared, we had a very different way of managing race, housing, land, and even state capitalism like you alluded to.
One of the most fundamental tenet of liberalism is the rights to property. In fact, it goes all the way back to Mills in the argument that land becomes private property when an individual labors on the land, because land is given in nature. So when does natural land turns into private property? So there is liberal theory of labor is that the labor that works on the land is entitled to the produce of the land, and the land becomes privatized that way, right? So land has always been this very central value of liberalism. But one of the most important idea in communism as practice is actually the nationalization of land, to revert land to collective ownership. And PAP government was first elected into power in 1959. The British government already had a law that allowed government to acquire land for public purposes. So the HDB actually intensified, the PAP actually intensified that land on compulsory education. And in effect, appropriated privately held land that were not utilized or underutilized in the early 1960s at a price, at a market value that is very, very low, set by the law. So in that sense, that the government, in addition to the land that the independent government received, self-government received from the what is called crown land, which is colonial government land, plus the land it appropriated, and the reclamation since then, right? The government ends up essentially owning almost 90% of the land in the entire country. So effectively, land in Singapore has been nationalized. Now, there was some objection against the Land Acquisition Act at that point, because what is interesting was that when we became independent in 1965, we actually basically took the whole Malaysian constitution. Instead of rewriting a whole new one, we basically adopted it immediately first. But the one clause that is left out was about the rights to property. And so soon after that, the land requisition law was changed to allow government to appropriate land. And one of the most interesting particular instance of that is that Bukit Ho Swee fire in 1961 left a whole large chunk of land in the city center. And the government acquired that land as if it's free of, free of residents. And because it's unencumbered, the compensation rate is very low. Right? So what you find is essentially by nationalizing land, the government essentially rejected a very fundamental right in liberalism, which is the right to property. Right? So even now, most, with the exception of 10 to 15% that are what we call freehold land, right? Everyone is actually leasing land from the government. And a lease is rental, right? So the government essentially owns all the land. And that's basically against liberalism, but also that is what makes public housing at a national scale possible. Because if the government have to pay land on market value, as in most liberal countries, it would not be possible to actually have a national housing system that practically provides for everyone.
That was the conclusion I had from reading your book as well, that it's in our land policy that you find the PAP government's ideology to be the most antithetical to liberalism. What did they use the land for? Because you consolidate 90% of the land, the obvious answer would be, yeah, you use it to, build public housing and then build infrastructure, but why do you need so much land?
Apart from sort of the obvious sort of public goods like, schools, roads, infrastructure, right? We have housing, right? We have public housing. In addition to the military installations that are necessary, and also extensive use of the waterfront for harbor. We're building Tuas Superport, right? And airport, Changi Airport and all that. So apart from all the infrastructural need and public institutions demand, right? The big user is housing. And the secondarily is that the government actually, by land ownership, is actually able to comprehensively plan the entire island. I mean, if you go to the URA, you'll see this whole map of Singapore in 3D, right? Almost every square inch is planned for, okay? There are blank buildings and so on, which are modeled, but, they are like for future use. So it allows the government to actually control the actual physical development of the country. And we are one of the most planned cities in the world. There's very little confusion of mixed use. If you go to older areas like maybe on Jalan Besar, you'll see maybe a restaurant next to a tire shop and all that. But that's really legacy, right? Because now it's completely planned. So land ownership then allows the government to continuously deal with redevelopment as economic contingencies develops. So, for example, the selective en bloc redevelopment. The early HDB are built in urban areas like Queenstown, and is now being demolished to intensify usage, right? If it was privately owned, the redevelopment process will be very difficult. So what happens is in this case, one of the features of Singapore is that there is always a rapid renewal of buildings, sometimes very wasteful, in fact, and sometimes very disruptive of people's memory of the country at that, right? But all that is the result of, owning land that gives the government the freedom to do that. Sometimes you see in other cities where, because lands are privately held, negotiating building a road could take years because of local objection, owners' refusal to sell their land and so on, right? So the Land Acquisition Act and land ownership are really powerful tools at the disposal of the government to actually deal with the physical development of the country.
Yeah, especially when you are such a land-scarce economy.
Yes.
Then you would, as the government, have every incentive to try to control as much of the factor input as you can. The consolidation of land allowed Singapore to essentially build up a very successful public housing program that many countries with more capital and more land couldn't do. I know there are some contradictions that come with the housing program, but I would like to first, ask, from your perspective, what has been the remarkable thing that has emerged out of this public housing policy experiment?
So land is one of the absolutely essential element for the housing program, right? But once the land is owned, then the government could use it in the way that it plans to do. So housing takes up that. The other important component in housing ownership, so to speak, is actually the availability of loans, mortgage. In a normal functioning capitalist economy, not everyone is able to borrow money from the bank. Not everyone has the credit reliability, right? Which is why home ownership is stratified. So what we have in Singapore is through the CPF system, right? Actually develop a mortgage system that is available to every working Singaporean, regardless of your level of income. And that is really important because it makes so-called home ownership possible across the board and not just for those who are able. I mean, in most countries, public housing system is only for those who are unable to pay their own way in the market, and so they need a subsidy, or they need subsidy in rental. They might also sometimes get assistance in mortgage interest rates, but public housing tend to be only for, it's a kind of residual welfare category, whereas in Singapore, public housing is actually technically speaking for the entire nation, right? And it's largely because everyone is able to actually pay for their housing monthly, as long as they buy a flat within their income bracket, right, through the CPF system. So, which is why the home ownership rate is so high, or 99-year lease rate is so high, because both the government has the land to build and the citizen have a means to own or to buy the 99-year lease, as long as they have continuous employment. If they have disrupted employment, then there will be some gaps in which, the monthly payment might be disrupted until re-employed or something. So that, I think the availability of loans to every citizen is a very important component that does not exist in a normal capitalist society. On the supply side, right, is the land. On the demand side is the availability of mortgage system. And the dovetailing of that creates this sort of high 99-year leasehold ownership system.
It seems to me that when I was reading through the history of HDB and maybe the governance, Singapore's political history, public housing was really high on the agenda also because there was a bundle of incentives the government wanted to put together. So an example is, when Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee were conceptualizing national service, they knew that, if I could guarantee people public housing or ensure that they have an asset to defend, they'll probably buy into the conscription system, right? Because now you have something to fight for, as opposed to maybe migrating to Australia or going to somewhere else, because you have to go and serve NS.
Well, actually, if you think about it, right, housing needn't be the top priority policy for the PAP government in 1959 or in early 1960. So, I mean, the PAP government got elected into power in 1959. In 1960, they already enacted the Housing Act, right? So it's 1 year, basically, of the new government, which means that it really did put a lot of priority on housing. And it really needn't be, even though it's true that, there were large population living in informal housing, or what we now call kampongs, or, or pejoratively called slums, right, or squatter areas. Already, I mean, people were living under those conditions. They were not ideal, but they were sort of housed. I mean, they were not like homeless on the street, right? And also, given the economic conditions of that time, living in a kampong actually has a lot of flexibilities because the unemployments were irregular, income were irregular, largely informal sector, and rent, therefore, rent in a kampong is very low and very flexible. Landlords is willing to, take arrears until, there is money to pay and so on. And, admittedly, the public hygiene condition wasn't great. But the colonial government had already identified housing, poor conditions, and the squatter areas in the kampongs, particularly urban fringe kampongs, as public health problem. And that's fairly common in most government thinking. Even now when you look at so-called developing countries where there's large squatter areas, there will always be this idea that public health condition is very poor. So there's that. But so in a way, the government picked up on one of the British colonial government's agenda, which is to improve housing quality, improve public hygiene conditions, in particularly in the congested urban shop house area and in the urban fringe kampong, right? So there's a kind of path dependency there. But I think what is more important is that in the 1959 election, the PAP government the PAP party at the time made a very clear promise that it will improve the physical living conditions of the nation. And so housing was a way of carrying through that election campaign promise. In addition to the fact that improving physical housing condition, right, is visually one of the most concrete, so to speak, illustration of the efficiency of the government, right?
Yeah.
Because it shows that the government is doing something and is visibly there. And if it improves the conditions of living, it's also undeniably materialist, right? So I think at both the symbolic and the practical level, housing is an area in which the government, particularly a very new government, is able to generate legitimacy, political legitimacy for itself. I guess once it gets started, the rest is so-called history, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's why I always claim that public housing is one of the key constituents of political legitimacy for the PAP, symbolically and materially.
It's interesting that you say that, because now that you say it, it's one of those policies where the policy leg is the shortest, right? Because now you decided you want to build public housing. It doesn't need to be completed, but as long as you can see that there's renovation going on, you can immediately feel it. Whereas, for example, let's say you're looking at education.
Education is
healthcare,
a long haul, yes.
It's much harder to visibly witness it.
Exactly.
That's a very interesting point on performance legitimacy.
Yeah.
The follow-on question that I had was that you had this idea of public housing, but private accumulation.
Right.
It's interesting because Singapore is probably the only country in the world that you have such a high occupancy rate in public housing. And housing in itself has a dual function. Its use function, the utility function, you use it to stay, but also its asset function, right? Where you use it as an investment.
Right.
You're making it from a private good essentially into a very much subsidized good.
From a subsidized good to a private good.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then the question I have is, what are some of the downstream effects of having HDB, and why do you come up with this idea of public housing and private accumulation?
I think that's really, in a certain sense, the public housing system has become a bit of a sort of victim of its own success. Public subsidy is supposed to be socioeconomically redistributive, right? So you hear the government giving grants and subsidizing housing and so on as a way of making housing available for all. So there's a kind of social redistributive effect. But because there's a secondary market where you can sell public housing into a market of willing buyers and willing sellers, right? Built into the sale is a profit. In being able to sell in the market, the goods that is the subsidized good, which is something of a welfare good, right, has now become a commodity, like every other object in the market. Once it's a commodity, there's a profit motive. Owning a 99-year lease on the flat and being able to sell that in the market makes the public housing flat a vehicle of wealth accumulation. Because if you buy at $300,000, sell at $500,000, you're pocketing $200,000 of gains. The question really is then, why does the government, right, allow a secondary market to develop? Why do you allow a public subsidized good, right, to be made a profitable commodity? That is really the big question. And because it has become a vehicle of private accumulation, right? Then, in fact, it introduces into the society a factor of inequality, because the wealthy, the higher income groups are the one who will buy the top end HDB, 4 and 5 room flats, right? The lower income groups will buy 3 room flats or smaller, generally only 3, 4, 5 room, right? The bigger flat will inflate at a higher rate in value, accrue, that is to say, it will accumulate greater value, right? So on its sale, those who are already in the upper income bracket are making more money than those who are in the lower market, right? So the wealth effect actually increases in income inequality. So if you look at all the $1 million flat that we are now very noisy about, they're all in the top end. They're either executive condos, 5-room flats, or 4-room flats in very good locations and with panoramic view and all that, right? But they are not in the 3-room flats. So in that sense, a public subsidy good has actually becomes a vehicle of private accumulation. Yep. And as a consequence of that, right, unintentionally, the HDB is in fact one of the factors that intensifies wealth inequality, right? And that actually, in a sense of political or public justice, a bit of a problem, right? Because it's a bit of a dilemma, which is why you have a lot of public in the forum calling for re-emphasizing public housing as residence rather than as asset, right? Because the idea of public housing as asset is actually an idea actively promoted by the government from the 1990s onwards.
That was something that Lee Kuan Yew himself said as a way to kind of highlight the PAP's track record.
Because Lee Kuan Yew actually himself said, if you buy a HDB flat, you sell it after 7 years and make money, and increase your asset wealth.
And that creates a problem, especially for the new entrants.
The new flats and existing flats, right, must be priced relatively, right? So as the resale flats prices go up, the new flats prices must go up in tandem at a certain discount, but it must go up, correspondingly, right? So in fact, the inflation affects much more those who are, successive ways of new entrants into the market, right? Which are paying more and more. Every successive generation pays more than the one before, right? Which is why now you have a lot of talk about affordability, because the quantum of payment is now actually quite high, right? I mean, especially it's been within 60 years. So there is still memories of the grandparent buying an HDB flat for $30,000, a 5-room point block for $30,000, and now a 4-room flat costs, somewhere $600,000 within the family itself in 3 generations, right? The comparison is huge. So this perception of affordability, right, is intensified, even at a very sort of micro level. Not even talking about the macro market conditions.
Is that perception real?
Whether it's real or not is really a difficult question, okay? Because if you think of the HDB flat, not in the interest of making money, okay? That is to say, if you actually, as you say, if you think of the HDB flat, all right, as residence, as use value, okay, then actually it's very affordable. So assuming you paid $1 million for a flat, and assuming you buy, say, a flat that has 70 years left, okay? Then you work it out. In 1 year, your cost will be somewhere around, let's say, $1 million divided by 70 years, right? But maybe somewhere maybe $15,000, $16,000 a year, right? Then if you break it down to monthly rent, it's very cheap, right? You basically pay no more than $2,000 a month for for 1,000 square feet of flat in a highly developed city like Singapore. You can't find that anywhere in the world, right? I mean, you can't even rent a sidewalk space in New York for that kind of money.
Yep.
So if you think in use value terms, right, it's inexpensive. But if you're thinking of you're paying already $600,000, $700,000, and you're trying to make some money off it, then the upfront cost is very high, and there's no guarantee that you will make that sum.
Yep.
Okay, so depends on how you calculate, right? Yep. I mean, I think unfortunately most Singaporean now doesn't think of the HDB flat as merely for living. Most of them are thinking how to resell the flat, right? And not only how to resell the flat, but resell the flat with a profit. If you think that way, then the HDB is no longer a welfare good. It's more than anything an investment good, right? And as an investment good, then the question of price becomes an issue.
Yeah. And I think that gets to the central point of the dilemma, which is that it's like property or housing is one of those goods where it has that dual function. You can't, when you look at a stock equity or some stock that you list on the exchange, it's purely investment because there's no real utility function. But in this case, you have both. And part of it is that the government is looking at it now as, okay, I'm subsidizing it because there's a utility for it. But the citizens have a different view. How do we then encourage people to kind of see public housing as more of a utility good than of a private or investment good?
Well, you see, the interesting thing is this. If you put your money in equity, right, you accept there is a risk of loss.
Yeah.
How many people do you think are willing to accept HDB as a possibility of loss?
Yeah.
Right? So that's a problem. Because actually, property investment, if you're investing in the private sector, the risk is there, right? If you can't rent it out for 2 years, you are continuously paying mortgage, right? And if there's a downturn, like, Sentosa was selling at half the price of what it was, okay, after COVID or during COVID, right?
Yeah.
But HDB, no one assumes that it's going to lose money. Okay? There are no such thing as an investment good that is risk-free. But the expectation is risk-free. And to a certain extent, that expectation is quite real. Because the way the pricing works, in fact, keeps the prices of HDB flat up.
Yeah.
I mean, it has... After 2011 election, the government changes certain regulations, certain policies. Prices did come down slowly by 1%, 1.5%. Until COVID, it lose about 10% cumulatively. But as soon as COVID was over, it shoots up like crazy, right?
Yep.
I mean, and this past year, recent accounting is like HDB prices gone up by close to 10%. That's a really high rate of increase against wage increases. And I think in this particular problem is that prices of resale flat will not be allowed to drop radically, because if it does, it would affect the potential retirement needs of older homeowners, right? Because they have, particularly those who are wage earners, who have put most of their CPF into housing, right? They need to recover the investment in cash to fund their retirement, right? So if the prices drop radically, the ability to fund the retirement years will potentially be jeopardized.
Yeah.
So the resale flat prices will not be allowed to drop radically, right? And the way to do that is to actually price new flats, right, at an appropriate distance. But new flats prices goes up. So what does the government do? Increase the grant proportion to the new buyer, right, to enable them to buy in at the down payment area, right? But it doesn't bring down the price. Okay? So, so that's basically the strategy. And then these other cooling measures like, loan quantum being reduced from 80% to 75%, discouraging second home ownership by increasing stamp duty to 30%. And okay? Those are actually soft mechanisms that isn't very radical in terms of trying to ameliorate the price increase. But those are the only tools that has been used. And none of them have effectively bring prices down.
You wrote that the rate of appreciation for housing actually outstrips your CPF rate of appreciation, right?
The CPF interest is fixed. So they'll take out as much money as they can to put into housing, right?
Yeah.
And since housing seems to be such a sure investment that is minimal risk, it's no-brainer, right?
So in a sense, there is this dilemma that you can never escape, which is that because of this dual function use of the good of public housing, people will just continually lean heavy towards the investment side.
I don't see any solution.
Yeah. And on top of that, there is a political dynamic as well, which I think you point out, because what the government has done essentially, or what the PAP government has done essentially, is they have made the relationship between the citizens and themselves through public housing as a customer or a client supplier or client provider relationship. And as a result, when prices go down or they don't go the way the consumer likes it, then
they get punished.
You're punished in the votes.
The ballot box, yes.
In the box.
One of the problem, and again, I mean, as I say, in certain sense, he's the victim of his own success. Because the government owns all the land, right? There are no alternative housing. Except if you're wealthy, you can buy in the 10-15% private sector, right?
Yeah.
Apart from that, the 85% or 80% of the country is totally dependent on the HDB for housing. Because we don't have squatter areas like, most major cities in Asia has, right? So that total dependency becomes a total obligation on the part of the government to supply, right? Both 99-year lease and rental, right? And any failure to supply, the HDB, they don't blame the HDB, because the HDB and the government are synonymous, right? If you say the HDB, you are also saying the government. So if the HDB fails in any measure, right, then, the anger is taken out in the ballot box. So what you find in 2011, where housing price inflation was really high, and the opposition party made it a political issue during the campaign. And I'm sure there is a contributing effect to the fact that the PAP received the lowest percentage of popular vote in its history. The legitimacy that comes with provision, which is a political capital, right, has also its downside in terms of obligation and in terms of political cost if the system doesn't function as a way the population expect.
There's this saying, they say if you borrow 5% of a bank's fund, you owe the bank. But if you borrow 95%, you own the bank.
Yeah.
If there's no alternative or the way out, and like what you said, this is essentially a marathon without an end.
Right.
How should the government constantly look at making sure that the housing prices are still kept affordable?
Well, there is like I say, depending on how one defines affordable, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at a certain in the use value definition, it's already very affordable, right? So how do you tone down this profit expectation, basically?
Yeah.
Okay, and in a market economy, that's very difficult, especially in a situation where the commodity price is not allowed to fall below a certain level without jeopardizing retirement, right? I mean, the government is very conscious about the need for retirement funding, right? Which is why they have different programs to encourage older citizens to sell big flats, buy downwards to two-room flexi flats, right? And buy short lease, and so that they can recover their funds in order to fund their retirement. So you have lease buyback scheme, you have this flexible scheme, short lease, flexible flat, two-room flexi flat scheme. All of those are strategies to recover investment, to fund retirement. So the government is well aware of this dilemma of particularly working class households who has no other assets, no equities, no portfolio and stuff, right? But have put most of their money into the one HDB asset. So there is no overall solution to the system. But I think there are targeted solutions as the problem emerge. For example, we're now into an aging population, super aging population, and then you develop specific programs or specific policies, right? Specific regulations to deal with the issue, rather than designing a completely new operating system.
There is another thread that I wanted to pull on that you highlighted previously, which is on the topic of inequality and how our current housing system might perpetuate that because it's fundamentally based on your income level, your ability to pay, as opposed to a needs-based system. Is there a way to shift closer towards a needs-based system?
50 to 60,000 households who are renting in the HDB are essentially the poor. They're even unable to buy the minimum flat, right? So that's the poor. So when you're talking about the poor, you're also talking about the rental tenants at the same time. And I think the argument there is that the rental units are actually, in a certain sense, under-providing, because regardless of the family size, right, you are actually, maximum rental unit is 2 rooms. And that is actually, internally speaking, within the household, very unhealthy, actually, living condition for a large family, especially if you have children of different ages, right? And that is not conducive to family living. So I think what more can be done there is that in the rental sector, needs become a more important, element to decide, rather than ability to pay. When you're stuck with the ability to pay, you often get, poor family with 3 or 4 kids living in 1-room flat. That's just not on, right? At the 99-year sales lease area, that is less of a problem in that sense. But when you have this at the rental level, I think that, supply to needs rather than ability to pay would be actually a more, so to speak, humane provision principle.
So it's about increasing the options that maybe these households, these 50 to 60,000 households have in terms of access to public housing.
Quite a large chunks are singles.
Yeah.
So that's okay. 1 room is okay, right? But when you get into family, then I think needs-based. In the long run, also probably a better principle because it helps the family life.
Yeah, it helped them definitely be more productive as well, right? Because now you're not that constrained and worried about the space that you have.
Yeah.
You're an educator, you're a sociologist yourself. Why should people take an interest in sociology?
I think studying sociology is actually an interesting question because it is a training of looking at the society itself, right? And in a way that understands also your own position within the social structure. All right. I mean, let's say for example, most people would think about family in terms of emotional connections and so on, right? But at a certain level, I mean, the family is a structure of inequality. Parents as one generation with resource, children as a younger generation without resource and dependency, right? And that dependency can become very antagonistic. This is why this is why you get these family problems, right? I mean, but so it allows you to also think about where you stand within the context you are in, whether it's family, whether it's in the company that you work in, or vis-a-vis the state. The way you think about yourself as a public housing owner, and the HDB, and by the HDB, the government, right? So I think there's an education of the self at the same time, and at the same time an understanding of how the society functions. Theoretically speaking, that kind of analytical ability, if you learn it right, you then acquire a certain skill navigating your life, so to speak. In terms of occupation, actually you find sociologists in almost every category of work, except things like engineering and medicine, where we are talking about highly very specific kind of skill. But in human resource management, in media, in general sort of service directed advertisement, service industries, you find sociologists in all of them because, in fact, they are all areas of study. I mean, one of the areas that I study is pop culture. So actually, the analytical skill is actually useful occupationally, professionally, in addition to the fact that you are able to sort of look at both your position and the larger society with much greater critical insights.
I'd like to ask you about your personal experience because you were the first sociologist in HDB working as a sociologist, right? What was the kind of lens that you took, or what was the kind of contribution that you were seeking to make then?
My first degree is actually in chemistry and biology, right? And I was actually going to be doing biomedical sciences when I was at undergraduate. But by the time I finished my undergraduate years, I realized that I don't have the personality to be a scientist. Scientists' lives are really quite tough. I mean, very lonely because you're tied to the lab, you're tied to the experiment, and you cannot tell whether it's going to succeed or not. It's a pretty tough situation, and I don't have the personality for it. That's when I switch out. In the HDB, one of the important things about the HDB, and this in my earlier book on public housing, it deals with that, is that because the HDB is building housing for the entire nation, it really needs to know how people use the spaces it creates. And it needs to know what kind of interaction patterns takes place within residents. All that is now town council business. But in the 80s, it's all part of the HDB business. I mean, HDB in the 80s was also managing housing estates. They were housing estate managers. They were not only developers building housing and doing planning, they were also managing. At that time, the CEO, Liu Taike, realizes that they need a lot more information about how places are being used and what kind of neighborly interactions are taking place. And so much of our research was actually spent in the housing estate, not in HDB headquarters, because we're out there all the time, just looking, asking questions, And we also did a 3-year sort of project on looking at people from kampongs who have been resettled into HDB housing estates and how different ages are adjusting to high-rise living because they've been always living on the ground. So there's quite a lot of sociological, anthropological work to be done.
What were some of the contributions that you made that you were either particularly proud of that you thought it shaped public housing in an interesting way?
Practically the entire nation live in HDB, right?
Yeah.
If the HDB makes one decision, it will affect
millions.
Everybody who comes under its jurisdiction, right? So if it redesigned the corridor, for example, right? There used to be long, if you look at older housing estates, they're very long corridors and only staircase on each end, right? Now, that actually, in a certain sense, it's good for surveillance because everybody can see the corridor, right? But at the same time, it's a little bit too many households for interactions to be comfortable. And people always get looked in and so on, right? So there was a period of time of experimenting with shorter corridors. And the question is, how many units is the optimum and that kind of stuff, right? So all those decisions are actually highly consequential, right? So that's why working in doing that kind of research, actually, any little bit of information that translate into some changes in the policy practice of HDB has a very serious effect, right?
My last question for you is, any advice you give to your fresh grads coming out of school, especially those who are considering getting a HDB?
First of all, the ability to buy a private property, if you're not going to inherit one, it's going to be extremely difficult. And I won't encourage anybody to set up aiming for it, okay? I think my strategy, my best advice to my students is that if I were buying a flat right now, right, I would buy a BTO flat in what is now called prime location. And I would buy the top end of prime location. It will be the most expensive in the HDB offer, right? But I would do that. And I would not think about moving. And I would think of it as my permanent home.
Mm.
And whatever equity, whatever cash that I might have in so-called upgrading, I would take my risk in the equity market. If you think seriously, investment in housing is very illiquid.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you are interested in money, then actually the stock market, you probably get better chances there in terms of return. If I had owned the flat that sold for, in Dawson, that sold for $1.7 million, I wouldn't have sold it.
So the key is to enjoy the housing that you get. Just enjoy it.
Exactly.
Yeah. With that, thank you, Prof, for coming on to help me dissect the Singapore housing miracle, and hopefully in the future we can continue to keep our housing prices affordable.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
If you enjoyed this episode, click on the video that's appearing on the screen right now.